It's great to welcome back to the program after a couple of years, I believe, Chris Martenson, who is, of course, the co-founder of peakprosperity.com. He speaks all over the world, one of the early econo-bloggers, serves on all sorts of panels, including UN panels. Chris, it's great to have you back. I was checking out some of the commentaries you've recently put out on peakprosperity.com. And you had an interesting discussion about how when we talk about crises, not all crises are equal. Some have very clear fixes, some don't. And this got me thinking about discussions about employment and labor and the economy in this presidential campaign that we have now. And I've noticed that missing from the discussions about who's going to be better for jobs or worse for jobs, who's going to reinvigorate manufacturing or the economy or whatever, missing are two sort of important ideas. One is that many of the manufacturing jobs that at one point did go overseas no longer exist, and they don't exist to be brought back to the US. And number two, and it's related, the idea that automation as a job eliminator also isn't destroyed by presidential candidates. So I want to open it up to you first generally. When you talk about not all crises being equal, what are you referring to, and how does this relate to the presidential election?
Well, David, good to be back with you and your listeners. And this important topic, and it's distinguished like this. We have to distinguish between problems and predicaments. Now, a problem has a solution. We can derive one, and usually politicians like to focus on the problem side because there's something that can be done. Even if that doesn't make a lot of sense, but there's something you can propose. A predicament doesn't have a solution. It just has an outcome that you have to manage. So Japan has a rapidly aging population. They're losing population on a net basis, and what's remaining is aging quickly, as I just said. So that's a predicament that really you have to manage that. And so there are a lot of things we're facing now that are predicaments, and our politicians aren't talking about them because they don't see a win, so they avoid them, but we don't get to avoid them because they're still with us.
So along the lines of the job automation side, my analysis has been Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump have any interest in bringing that up, because if they are the first to, the other will say, look at that. My opponent is basically just admitting we're going to lose jobs. Yeah. It's because of technology, sure. But that is a loss, and it is a point of being able to be attacked. And so is that a sense in which, in our example about job automation, there's really no political advantage to being upfront and saying, hey, everybody, there's a bigger picture predicament, to use your vocabulary, that we need to think about when we look at unemployment or stimulus or whatever else it might be?
That's absolutely correct. So let's look at a couple of examples. We know that there are 260,000 robots operating in the United States right now, and the number is growing exponentially as we're speaking. And some of these are pretty obvious. People say, oh, well, we can see how this robot is now welding seams in a car plant, so we don't need the welder, the human welder, in that car plant. I see how that job got taken away. But we're all the way down to the point now where they're having robots essentially take the orders in McDonald's and other pieces of automation, which are doing away with the human component of labor. And this is a trend. It's going on. It's going to continue to accelerate because, humans are expensive, relatively speaking. And because business in America is now all about just making money, it's always about the profits. It's about your profits. There's no more sense of greater duty that Henry Ford said, way back at the turn of the last century, where he said, if I pay my workers enough to afford my cars, I win. That seems to be missing from the dialogue. Neither party seems to be interested in actually talking about that, but the predicament remains. And if they were daring enough, they would A, mention that it happens, and then B, say, here's what we need to understand. We have to engage in this world in a new way. And we're going to have to try some new things. They would have to be bold. They would have to display real leadership, and they would have to be willing to risk a few corporate dollars in their campaign coffers to make those statements.
I want to get to the engaging with the world in a new way, because this is something we've been talking about a lot. But before we get to that, for our audience, what are some of the other bigger picture predicaments that you've identified that are going to sort of shape the picture of society and economies going forward?
Great question. This is my passion. It's my work. It's everything I focus on at Peak Prosperity. I've spent about 10 years on this. I'll spend the next 20 years if I'm alive that long or however long I've got. This is what I want to focus on. We're facing predicaments and large scale future trends, not just in jobs and automation, but ecologically with respect to our energy and energy sources and economically. And in particular, the explosive rise of debt globally all over the world. These are all gigantic predicaments that we absolutely need to face square up because our leaders aren't facing them to head on. That's why I do what I do. I'm here to first educate people about what the context is. And then when people go, whoa, that's a big story, what do I do? It's about the solutions that we can all engage in on a personal level that makes sense given the larger context. And oh, by the way, if we all did these steps that I recommend, I think we'd be making the world a better place and we'd be creating a world worth inheriting. There's lots we can do, but we're not doing at the national global level. So guess what? That means it's up to us to do these things.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between when you talk about debt more broadly as a global predicament? Because we've discussed quite a bit how typically Republican politicians using, quote, paying down the debt as a way to improve the economy is not really backed up by most serious economic analyses. But that's sort of at the micro, country, political solution level. Can you talk about how that's different than what you're saying with regard to global debt?
Absolutely. And this is a critical distinction. Let me draw it this way. When the crisis began in 2007, we had about I'm rounding numbers here, we had about $150 trillion in debt outstanding worldwide. Now, this is just debt. This isn't unfunded liabilities like Social Security being underfunded or pensions, just debt. And since 2007 to the end of 2014, that debt exploded by $57 trillion. We're over $200 trillion in debt worldwide. Now, here's the thing about debt that's not being talked about at the micro or even the macro level where it really needs to. What is $200 trillion in debt really saying to us? I know it's a big number. I can't even think of how big it is. But 200 trillion is saying we need the future to be bigger than the present. By bigger, we mean more cars sold, more economic output and activity, more throughput of resources. We need more from the world. We have to shove it through our economic machine just so we can pay back that 200 trillion. But the entire banking system says 200 trillion. We need that to be 220 and then 240 and then eventually 300 trillion because that's the model. It's always based on growth. So I mentioned ecology a little while ago. I'm one of those guys who says, hey, hold on. The Earth is a sphere. That means it has a finite volume. It has a fixed limit. And we're acting politically and economically as if no limits exist. But our generation, the people alive listening to this right now, are alive at a time when humans as a species are running up against hard limits. And we can see them. Fisheries collapsing, insects and other species disappearing at alarming rates. The 2016, every month being the hottest one on record. These are all signs that say, oh, yeah, there's some real actual limits here that have nothing to do with how much money or debt's in the system. Debt is a claim on real stuff. Real stuff is in fixed supply. That's the battle over the next 5, 10, 20, maybe forever number of years. And very few people are looking at this at a really large level, but it's happening. And people listening to this will already know it's happening if they open the newspaper and just read.
So we're talking about a planet that is of finite size and resources. We're talking about a significant change to labor in that previously new technologies actually expanded the number of jobs available by creating new industries. And now most of what I would consider sensible estimates say now technology is actually net eliminating jobs. What do you see as the sort of changing relationship between humans and our existence on the planet? And at the sort of political level, one of the things I keep going back to is, should we be thinking about some kind of basic income that disaggregates someone's job and daily activities from some basic ability to live on this planet? Is that something that is interesting to you? What else are you thinking about?
David, those and many other things, which we could put in a bucket called non-status quo solutions. So before I dive into a couple of those, here's where I think the battle's going to be won or lost. It's in the narratives we run. Now, humans, for about, if this is the entire human history, written word came in right at the very end. Otherwise, it was all this oral tradition. We're used to stories and narratives, and they run our lives. We're aware of this on a daily, individual basis, right? The story I have in my head makes me either experience joy or suffering. The stories drive our behaviors. So we have a cultural story that's wrong. And that cultural story is growth is good. Now, it has been for a long time, but it's no longer serving us because that growth, when it runs into limits, tends to break on the shores that it rams into without noticing they're there. So here's the positive side of this story. I visited the farms that are building topsoil at incredible rates, where if everybody did that, we would take more carbon out of the atmosphere in 10 years than has been put in through all of human existence. But we're not farming that way. We're farming a different way, which is actually, we're doing the opposite of that and putting carbon into the atmosphere. The difference between the positive story and the current story we're running is the narrative. And the narrative says, oh, making money is the most important thing, and that's why this is the best way to farm. So let's keep doing that. We have to change that narrative and says, no, we're not here to just make money. We're here to enjoy our time on the planet and leave it as good or better for the next everythings, not just humans, that follow, because we're part of an overall system. So if I had to break the narrative down, we have a narrative of growth that's based on this idea of extraction, and it's very isolated. We isolate from each other and also from the natural world. And instead, we need a different narrative that's more regenerative, and it's relational. And we have the technologies in place already that can do that. If better ones come along, super, but we don't need them. If we had a different narrative today, we could be putting our money and our resources towards things that actually matter. You know, that old model of we're going to squabble over resources and fight deadly wars when we don't get our way, those need to be replaced with a more global sense of this is kind of an emergency. We really have to figure out a lot of things all at once. We're going to have to shift our cultural, political, and economic institutions at a pace that's never been done in human history. It's an awesome challenge. I'm actually excited by it, but if and only if we have the right story running, and the right story has to be we're stewards, not consumers, if that's not too broad of a shift.
Real quick, just in the last few seconds we have on the basic income thing. Interesting idea given where things are going, thinking too small, not practical. What do you think?
It's an interesting idea, but incentives are everything to humans. A lot of humans, given the incentive of not having to work, won't work. And I'm a big believer that if a basic income can make sense, but it needs to be tied to something where everybody has a sense of investment in this common experiment that we're all running together. So there's ways I think it could be done well, and other ways it could be done poorly. It's a very complex question.
We'll have to have you back, because all the studies I've seen suggest that most people, even given a basic income, would still work. They might just work in something they actually like, as opposed to what they are sort of stuck in by the very nature of our society. But a conversation for a different day. Chris Martenson, co-founder of peakprosperity.com. Of course, check out his infamous crash course. Chris, it's so great to talk to you as always.
Thank you, David. Pleasure's been mine.